Welcome to Story Horizon. I'm the storyteller, here to help you drift into a peaceful sleep tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing stories. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let yourself relax. Let's begin our journey. Story 1. It was a gray, windswept morning when I saw him, a lone figure on the old dock by the lake, hunched over his fishing line. The rain was just beginning to fall, a light drizzle that speckled the water in tiny ripples, but he didn't seem to mind. I almost turned back, figuring no one would be out in weather like this. But something about the way he sat, so steady and calm, made me curious. He was an old man, older than anyone I'd seen fishing there before. His skin was deeply wrinkled, and his face had the kind of rough, worn look that only a lifetime outdoors could carve. Yet there was a quiet warmth in his expression, a peace that seemed to ripple out across the lake itself. I nodded in greeting as I approached, and he returned it with a slight tilt of his head, his eyes focused on the water. "You're out early," he remarked in a voice like gravel softened by time. "Not many people come here when it's raining." "Guess I didn't expect anyone else would be here," I replied, settling in beside him. "But it's peaceful this way." He nodded, eyes never leaving the line. A bit of rain never hurt anybody. For a while, we fished in silence, each of us watching our lines and the way the water moved under the rain. He was good at it, more patient than I'd ever been, holding the rod with the kind of reverence I'd only seen in old-timers who truly knew what they were doing. After a time, he broke the silence. "You fish here often?" "Whenever I get the chance," I answered, shifting slightly on the dock. "My dad used to bring me here when I was a kid. Figured I'd keep up the tradition." The old man gave a soft chuckle, his eyes twinkling as he looked out over the lake. "Funny how certain places carry memories, don't they? My father taught me to fish on a lake like this, too. Been coming back to places like this all my life." I glanced at him, intrigued. There was something about him, a quiet depth that made me want to know more. "Do you come here often?" "First time at this spot," he replied, looking down at his hands. But I felt like it was time to start coming again. Time to keep a promise. There was a pause, a slight hesitation, and then he spoke again, almost as if he were talking more to himself than to me. "My wife, she always loved the lake, said it reminded her of home. Before she passed, I promised her I'd go back to the water one day, find a place that felt right, and spend some time there. Thought I might have missed my chance. But well, here I am." I didn't know what to say. It was a simple story, but something in his voice made it feel like a confession, a release of something he'd carried for years. "I'm sure she'd be glad to know you're here," I offered quietly, feeling the weight of his words settle in the mist around us. He nodded, his gaze distant, lost somewhere between the water and his memories. I like to think she'd feel at peace, knowing I kept my word. Sometimes, that's all we can do, isn't it? Keep our promises and hope they mean something. We sat in silence after that, watching the rain fall, both of us caught up in our thoughts. It felt like the lake was listening, like the whole world had slowed down to give him this moment. The rain fell harder, the drops bouncing off the water, and the gray clouds overhead made everything feel softer, quieter. Then, just as I was about to speak, his line jerked. With surprising agility, he gripped the rod, his eyes sharpening as he reeled it in. There was a flash of silver under the surface, and in a moment, he had it, a sleek, shining fish thrashing on the end of his line. The old man looked at the fish, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Carefully, almost reverently, he unhooked it, his hand steady despite the rain. Then, with a soft sigh, he lowered the fish back into the water, watching as it swam away, disappearing into the depths. Some things aren't meant to be held on to, he murmured, more to himself than to me. Sometimes, just letting go is enough. The words hung in the air, mingling with the soft rhythm of the rain. I felt something shift in me as he spoke, a quiet realization that resonated with his story and his gentle act of release. There was a peace to it, a lesson I didn't fully understand but knew I wouldn't forget. After a few more moments, he packed up his rod, nodding to me with a warmth that was both simple and profound. "Thanks for the company, son," he said. "I think I found what I came for." The storm had rolled in quicker than I'd expected. One minute, the park was sunny and warm, and the next, dark clouds were racing across the sky, and the first drops of rain were already pattering against the leaves. I'd left my umbrella at home, thinking I'd only be out for a quick walk, but the sky had other plans. Before I knew it, a steady downpour began, and I found myself looking for the closest bit of cover. That's when I saw it, a huge, old oak tree, just off the path, its branches thick and sprawling, creating a natural canopy. I made a dash for it, slipping under its wide arms, just as the rain started coming down in earnest. The tree was magnificent, with a trunk that looked ancient, gnarled roots twisting into the earth, and leaves so thick that hardly a drop of rain could slip through. I stood there, catching my breath, listening to the rain hammer against the leaves overhead. There was something calming about the sound, a steady rhythm that made the world feel small and intimate, as if this little space under the oak was its own world. And then, from the other side of the tree, I heard a small voice. "You got caught too." Startled, I looked over and saw a woman standing there, tucked under the same branches. She had a quiet, almost shy smile, her hair damp from the few stray raindrops that had made it through the leaves. Her face looked familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. "Yeah," I laughed, shrugging. "I thought it was going to be a quick walk." "Me too," she said, adjusting her coat. "Guess we both underestimated the weather." There was a pause as we stood there, both listening to the rain, the silence between us comfortable, not awkward. She looked like she was in her 30s, maybe a little older, with an open, thoughtful expression. We exchanged a few glances, the kind strangers share when they're caught together in an unexpected moment, and eventually, I couldn't help but ask, "You come to the park often?" She nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Most weekends, actually. There's something nice about the quiet here, especially when it rains. It's like the whole world just slows down." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I don't come here as often as I used to. Used to come with someone, but haven't in a while." Her gaze softened. "It's funny. I come here for the same reason," she said. "My husband and I used to walk here every Saturday. We had this silly tradition. Every time it started raining, we'd try to find the biggest tree we could and wait out the storm together." She looked down, a little wistful, and I knew without asking that he was no longer here. It was something in her tone, in the way she spoke of him, as if he was still a part of her day-to-day, even though he wasn't. There was a comfort in it, though, a peace that she seemed to carry with her. I nodded, feeling a connection that went beyond words. "I understand," I said quietly. "My wife and I, well, we used to sit on that bench over there. Rain or shine, it didn't matter. We'd just sit and talk, sometimes about everything, sometimes about nothing." She looked out at the empty bench, her expression softening. "It's amazing how places hold memories, isn't it? Like they keep a part of the people who were there." We stood there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, in our own memories. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm that felt like a gentle heartbeat. It was as if the tree was wrapping us in its own quiet wisdom, reminding us that life moved on, but that didn't mean we had to leave everything behind. After a while, she sighed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You know, she said. He used to tell me that rain was just the world's way of washing itself clean. It's a reset, he'd say, every single time. I never believed him. But now, I think he was onto something. I looked up at the branches above us, watching the raindrops slip off the leaves and fall to the ground. Maybe he was right. Maybe it's a chance to start over, even if just for a little while. She looked at me then, and there was something in her eyes, understanding, maybe, or acceptance. It was a look that told me she'd been through the same kind of grief, that she'd found a way to live with it, to let it soften instead of harden her. We stood there for a while longer, both of us quietly sharing the shelter of the tree, sharing memories with the people we'd lost, and, in some strange way, with each other. The rain began to ease, the clouds breaking slightly, letting a hint of sunlight filter through. "Well," she said finally, looking up at the clearing sky, "I suppose that's our cue." I nodded, but neither of us moved. It was as if the tree had wrapped us in its own small world, a world we weren't quite ready to leave. But eventually, she stepped out from under the branches, glancing back with a soft smile. "Thanks for the company." "Thank you," I replied, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. As she walked away, I looked back at the tree, feeling like it had offered me something that day, a place to rest, a moment of connection, a reminder that, even in loss, there could be peace. And as I walked away, stepping back into the world beyond the branches, I felt lighter, as if the rain really had washed something away, leaving a small space for something new to begin. Story 3. It was a rainy evening when I finally sat down to write the letter I'd been avoiding for years. The room was dimly lit. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the soft hum of the rain against the window seemed to press down on me, as if urging me forward. I took a deep breath, picked up the pen, and began to write. "Dear Dad." The words looked strange on the page, a greeting I hadn't written in a long time. My father and I hadn't spoken in years, not since he'd left when I was a teenager, vanishing from our lives with barely a word. Growing up, I tried to forget him, to push him out of my mind like he had pushed us out of his life. But the older I got, the more I found him slipping back into my thoughts, like an itch I couldn't quite reach, a puzzle I couldn't solve. I wasn't even sure where this letter would go. I didn't have an address for him, just a hollow space in my life shaped like his absence. But tonight, something in me felt ready to try, as if the rain was washing away years of bitterness, leaving room for something I couldn't yet name. Asterisk, I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you even care to, but I needed to say a few things, even if it's just for me. Asterisk. I paused, staring at the words, wondering how to put years of confusion, resentment, and longing into sentences. How do you write to someone who's practically a stranger? Someone you once loved fiercely, but hardly remember now. Asterisk, when you left, I told myself I didn't care. I told myself you were just one less person to worry about, one less person to disappoint me. But the truth is, I did care. And maybe, in some ways, I still do. Asterisk. The pen felt heavy in my hand, as if it were pulling memories from me with every stroke. Memories I hadn't wanted to revisit. Birthday parties where I waited by the door, convinced he'd walk through at any minute. Days spent searching his face in crowds, hoping for a glimpse. I realized I'd spent years running from these memories. Yet here they were, surfacing like secrets long buried. Asterisk, I used to wonder if it was me, if I had done something to make you leave. You were my dad, after all. Weren't you supposed to stay? Weren't you supposed to be the one person who wouldn't walk away? Asterisk. My throat tightened as I wrote, feeling the weight of those questions, questions that had lingered in the back of my mind for years. There was a time when I'd been angry, a white-hot rage that flared up whenever anyone mentioned him. But anger has a way of exhausting itself, of hollowing you out until there's nothing left but sadness, a quiet ache that never quite goes away. Asterisk, maybe you had your reasons. Maybe you thought we were better off without you. I'll never really know, will I? But I need you to know that I tried, Dad. I tried to understand. I tried to forgive you, asterisk. I stopped, the words blurring as tears pricked at my eyes. Forgiveness. It was a word I'd struggled with for so long, a word that felt impossible, unreachable. But here, in the quiet of my room, with the rain as my witness, it felt like maybe, just maybe, I could get close. Asterisk, I can't change the past, and I can't undo the years we missed. But I think I can forgive you. Not for you, maybe, but for me. Because holding on to this hurt has only made it harder to move forward, harder to love and be loved, asterisk. The rain tapped steadily against the window, a gentle rhythm that felt almost comforting. I realized that this letter wasn't really about him. It was about me, about finding peace with the pieces he'd left behind. Asterisk, I hope wherever you are, you found some kind of peace. I hope you think of us sometimes, and I hope, in some way, you know I don't hate you. I may never understand why you left, but I think I can finally accept it, asterisk. I set the pen down, feeling a strange sense of lightness, as if the words on the page had lifted a weight from me. For so long, I'd held onto this anger, this sense of betrayal, as if it were a shield. But now, I felt something new, something close to relief, a quiet space where pain had once been. Maybe he'd never see the letter. Maybe it would sit in a drawer, gathering dust, or end up in the trash. But that didn't matter. Writing it had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, the freedom to let go. I folded the letter and tucked it into an envelope, my heart a little lighter, my mind a little clearer. And as the rain began to slow, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moonlight, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, like the first breath after a storm. It wasn't closure, not really, but it was a step toward healing, a step toward a future that wasn't weighed down by the past. And for the first time, I felt like I was ready to move forward, even if it meant carrying him, in some small way, with me. Story 4. It was a rainy afternoon when the flowers arrived, an unexpected bouquet of wildflowers, their bright colors softened by the gentle mist outside. I'd been working at my desk, half listening to the patter of rain on the window, when the knock came. A delivery man stood in the doorway, holding the flowers with a small, knowing smile. "These are for you," he said, handing them over. I frowned, glancing around, almost expecting someone to jump out and shout surprise. I hadn't received flowers in years, and as far as I knew, no one had any reason to send them now. There was a simple card attached, one of those small, rectangular ones that florists use. It read, "For someone who once showed kindness." No name, no other message, just those 7 words. I turned the card over, searching for a clue, but it was blank on the back. The mystery nagged at me, and I spent the rest of the afternoon glancing at the bouquet, the scent of wildflowers filling my office. Each time I looked at it, I was struck by a strange feeling, a sense that whoever had sent it knew me, knew something about me that even I had forgotten. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pay a visit to the florist shop listed on the delivery slip. It was a small, tucked-away place I hadn't noticed before, hidden between a bakery and an old bookstore downtown. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roses, eucalyptus, and something sweet I couldn't quite place. The shop was charmingly cluttered, every surface covered with blooms and greenery, like a secret garden in the middle of the city. Behind the counter stood a woman, probably in her 60s, with kind eyes and a soft smile that made her look as though she'd just stepped out of a storybook. She was arranging a bouquet of lavender and baby's breath, her hands moving with practiced ease. "Hello," I said, approaching the counter. "I got a bouquet yesterday, and I'm trying to find out who sent it." She looked up, her eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and mischief. "Ah, so you're the one," she murmured, as if she'd been expecting me. She set the lavender down, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought you might come in. You know who sent them, then?" I asked, my heart beating a little faster. I convinced myself it was a simple gesture from an old friend or a long-forgotten acquaintance. But something about her expression made me think there was more to it. The florist tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "Do you remember, a few years back, helping a young man outside the hospital? He'd hurt his hand, was bleeding, and you stopped to help him." I blinked, caught off guard. I'd nearly forgotten that day. I'd been leaving the hospital after visiting a friend when I saw a young man sitting on the curb, clutching his hand. Without thinking, I'd rushed over, using a spare handkerchief to wrap his wound, and stayed with him until someone could help. "Yes, I remember," I said slowly, piecing it together. "But that was such a small thing. I didn't think twice about it." The florist nodded, smiling as if she'd heard that kind of response 1,000 times. "To you, maybe. But to him, it meant the world. He didn't have anyone else that day, and a stranger's kindness made all the difference. He came here a few weeks ago and asked me to send you flowers, to thank you. He didn't want to leave his name, just asked me to pass along a message." I looked down at the bouquet. The bright colors, somehow more vivid now that I knew their story. "I don't understand why now. It's been so long." The florist's eyes softened. "Sometimes people carry gratitude with them, waiting for the right moment to express it. He wanted you to know that kindness matters, even the small, ordinary kind. He hoped it would remind you, and maybe inspire you to keep being kind." I felt a lump form in my throat, the weight of her words settling over me. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried so much meaning. I thought of all the small, unnoticed acts of kindness that happen every day, the ones we brush off, thinking they don't matter, but they do. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never see. "Thank you," I murmured, not sure if I was speaking to the florist, the young man, or the flowers themselves. She nodded, understanding, and returned to her bouquet, leaving me with my thoughts. As I stepped out of the shop, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, the world around me softened by the mist. I clutched the flowers close, breathing in their scent, feeling an unexpected warmth bloom in my chest. From that day on, I kept the memory of the flowers close, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, is never wasted. And every now and then, on a rainy day, I'd find myself passing by that little flower shop, wondering if the young man ever knew just how much his gratitude had meant to me. In the end, I suppose, that's the beauty of kindness. It doesn't need recognition. It simply grows, like wildflowers after the rain, waiting to brighten someone else's world when they least expect it. Story 5. It was one of those bitterly cold winter nights, the kind where the wind seemed to cut right through you, no matter how many layers you wore. I'd been out late, rushing through the city streets, hoping to make it back home before the cold settled too deeply into my bones. But then, as I rounded a corner near the old library, I saw him, a man huddled in a doorway, wrapped in nothing but a thin jacket, his face buried in his arms to shield himself from the wind. I slowed down, something inside me telling me not to just walk past. There was a familiarity in his posture, a quiet resignation that I'd seen before, though I couldn't place where. He didn't ask for anything, didn't even look up as I approached. He was simply there, blending into the city night like a forgotten detail in the landscape. All I had with me was a wool blanket, something I'd taken from the car on a whim because I thought I might need it for warmth. It was thick, scratchy, the kind my grandmother used to keep folded at the end of her bed, and I hadn't given it much thought until that moment. But standing there, with the man huddled in front of me, that old blanket seemed like a lifeline. Without a word, I knelt down and draped the blanket over his shoulders. He startled, looking up at me with a pair of eyes that were both wary and grateful. "Thank you," he whispered, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, his fingers trembling. I managed a small smile, nodding. "Stay warm," I murmured, then continued on my way, thinking I'd probably never see him again. I thought about him often after that night, wondering if he'd found warmth, if he'd gotten back on his feet. I even checked the corner near the library a few times, but he was never there, and eventually, the memory faded, becoming one of those quiet moments you tuck away. Not quite forgotten, but not quite remembered, either. Months passed, the seasons changed, and soon winter returned. I'd all but forgotten about the man in the doorway until one day, a few blocks from my office, I noticed a small package left on the bench outside the building. My name was scribbled on the top in careful, shaky letters, though I didn't recognize the handwriting. Curious, I picked it up, unwrapping it slowly. Inside was the same wool blanket I'd given away, neatly folded and clean, smelling faintly of lavender, like someone had washed it with care. My heart skipped a beat, a strange mix of surprise and warmth settling over me. There was a note tucked between the folds, written on a small piece of lined paper. Asterisk, thank you for what you did that night. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. That blanket got me through more nights than you'll ever know. I'm doing better now, and I thought you should have it back, to pass on to someone else who might need it someday. Asterisk. I sat down on the bench, the weight of the blanket in my lap, feeling a lump form in my throat. It was such a simple thing, a blanket, a gesture of warmth in a moment of cold, but to know it had meant something to him, that it had somehow helped, felt like a small miracle. I found myself wondering about his journey, how he'd managed to turn things around, who had helped him along the way. And then I realized that maybe he'd never be able to fully explain it, just like I'd never really understand how much that one small act had mattered. But in a way, it didn't matter. Kindness has a way of echoing, of weaving through lives in ways we can't always see. Since that day, I've kept the blanket in my car, ready for whenever I might come across someone else who needs it. And each winter, when the cold winds start blowing through the city again, I think of the man in the doorway, wrapped in wool, finding warmth in a simple gesture. I haven't seen him since, but I like to think that wherever he is, he knows that he passed something along, something much warmer than a blanket. It was a reminder that kindness, however small, has a way of coming full circle, bringing warmth even on the coldest of nights. Story 6. It was the kind of rainy afternoon that made the whole world feel nostalgic, like everything was wrapped in a soft, gray blanket. I'd been sorting through the attic, a chore I'd put off for months, thinking it'd be easy to just toss out old things and make some space. But as I dusted off boxes and peeked inside, I found a small wooden chest, tucked in the back corner, nearly hidden under a pile of blankets. I recognized it immediately. It was the old memory box my grandmother had given me years ago, filled with mementos from my childhood, tokens of people and places I hadn't thought about in ages. I carried the box downstairs and settled by the window, listening to the rain as I slowly opened the lid. Inside, it was like a treasure trove of moments frozen in time, each item bringing back a flood of memories. The first thing I pulled out was a faded Polaroid picture of me and my best friend, Maria, from a summer camp years ago. We were smiling, arms around each other, faces sunburnt from long days spent outdoors. I could almost hear the laughter, the endless conversations, the secret notes we'd pass each other. We'd promised to be friends forever, but life had taken us in different directions, as it often does. and somewhere along the way, we'd lost touch. I found myself smiling at the memory, wondering where she was now, if she remembered those days as fondly as I did. Next, I found an old ticket stub from a concert my dad had taken me to when I was a teenager. It was a small thing, a cheap ticket that he probably had to save for, but to me, it had felt like the world. I remembered the way we'd laughed, the way he tried to sing along even though he didn't know the words. I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder, hear his voice over the crowd. He passed away a few years back, but that ticket stub felt like a little piece of him, a reminder of the moments we'd shared that were still alive somewhere within me. There was a pressed flower next, carefully tucked between two pieces of wax paper. I held it gently, remembering how I'd picked it from a park near my first apartment. I'd been going through a rough patch then, feeling alone and uncertain, and I'd kept that flower as a symbol of hope, a reminder that life had beauty even in the hard times. Looking at it now, I felt the same comfort I'd felt back then, a gentle reminder that I'd made it through once, and I could make it through again. As I went through the box, I found letters from old friends, little notes from my mother, a handful of seashells from a beach trip I'd nearly forgotten. Each item was a doorway to a different time, a different version of myself, one I hadn't realized I'd missed until I saw it there, captured in something as simple as a note or a picture. Then, at the very bottom of the box, I found a small journal I'd kept during college, a time when I'd been full of dreams, convinced I could take on the world. I hadn't opened it in years, but I felt a pang of curiosity, wondering what that younger version of me had thought, what she had worried about, what she had hoped for. Flipping through the pages, I saw entries filled with passion and fear, ambition and doubt. I laughed at some of the things I'd written, smiled at others, feeling a mix of gratitude and tenderness for the person I'd once been. By the time I'd gone through everything, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, the light shifting as the sun began to break through the clouds. I closed the box, my heart full of warmth, the kind that only comes from reconnecting with parts of yourself you thought were lost. I realized, in that quiet moment, that we carry so many versions of ourselves, layers built from people, places, and experiences that shape us, sometimes in ways we don't notice until we look back. That little box was more than just a collection of things. It was a reminder of where I'd come from, of the love and laughter that had filled my life, and of the strength I'd found in both joy and heartache. I carefully placed the box back in the attic, but I knew I'd keep it closer to my heart this time. Those memories, those little fragments of who I used to be, felt like gifts, pieces of myself that had been waiting for me to remember them. And as I closed the attic door and stepped back into the world, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, like the rain had washed away more than just the dust, leaving me with a sense of wholeness I hadn't even realized I was missing.